father went to the USSR.
Yes.
In the early 30s, and he, he basically was leading tours. He really believed in this idea of the Soviet Union, right?
Right.
Could you talk a little bit about that and how it influenced you?
Oh, sure. That too is a long but interesting story. He grew up in Kansas and he didn't know anything about the outside world. But when he went to grad school at Columbia, he witnessed soup lines on the sidewalk, people lining up to get food during the Depression. And then he saw this idea of socialism and the Soviet Union, and that's the answer to America's problems. So he went to the Soviet Union full of preconceived ideals that he wanted to find, and he did find because he didn't know Russian and he didn't stay for long. So he got misled. I don't blame him for that. And he came back, a committed socialist right to the end of his life. He was. In his 90s, he was still writing donation checks to the Communist Party of America. He never joined the party, but he was ideologically on their side. And so I grew up in a family with that kind of political value. And when I went to college and things like the civil rights movement came along for Black people's right to vote in the South in the 60s, I was all for that, and I was an activist. And then when the anti-Vietnam War movement came along, I was not only an activist, I was a leader among activists. I was the editor of a journal that we called the Bulletin for Concerned Asian Scholars, graduate students and others who were opposed to the U.S. war in Vietnam. So I went to China in the 1970s for the first time, still with those idealistic notions of what socialism is. And then when I got on the ground in China and saw that it wasn't so, that ideal web of what it's supposed to be just isn't the way daily life works, and that even language is bifurcated. There's an official language where you say the words of socialism, and you have to. If you want to get something on campus at Zhongshan University, where I was, you can't go in and say, I need X. You need to go in and say, would the party committee be so kind as to consider the party central's directive number XYZ? That you have to play a language game. Whereas in daily life talk is still daily life. And this bifurcation of language became very interesting to me. And then in the long run, of course, I sided with the daily life level of language and sympathized with the victims of this system. And I came back in 1980 after a year in China and told my father and my mother. My mother was also a socialist, but not as theoretical as my father. I said, in essence, it's just not true. Your ideal vision of China isn't there. And they didn't believe me. So I had this plan to arrange for them to go to Zhongshan University in Guangzhou, where I had been. And they went in 1973 for 7 months. And my father taught American history and my mother taught English, and they lived there and they came back. And I asked him, so what do you think of China now? Oh, China's doing great, my father said. Well, why is that? They're getting rid of spiritual pollution.
Oh.
Which in 1983, that was the current political campaign. And they bought it hook, line, and sinker. And they still couldn't see through the official web of language and the official version of what China was to see what the reality was. And that was a puzzle for me for a time. And why couldn't they see? And I have two basic speculations on that. One is that they didn't know Chinese, and I did. And so I could talk to people and read in Chinese and get closer to daily life much more easily than they could, because everything they did and said had to go through the interpretation of the Foreign Affairs Office that hosted them. That's one reason. And the other, especially for my father, is he just couldn't release his original ideals, his original hope. And I don't blame him for that. There's a whole generation of Chinese writers that are like that too, who joined the revolution in the late 40s, early 50s, were idealistic communists, and then got knocked in the teeth in 1957 at the anti-rightist movement and tortured and mistreated in the Cultural Revolution again. And then after Mao dies and they come out and we're having reform and opening, and the young people are saying, okay, a new direction for China, forget the Cultural Revolution. They found it hard to do that. There's something I think about human life that if you really throw your ideals and your faith into a certain kind of belief and then it gets betrayed, you can't let go. It's like saying my whole life was wasted. I took the wrong route. And Chinese writers that I got to know well and read, Wang Meng is a good example. He's like that. He came back after Mao died, and his first book was Bolshevik Salute, where he goes to Tiananmen and salutes the fluttering flag of the Communist Party of China, wanting it to be true that the original ideals that he had embraced in the late 40s were still the right ideals, and that Mao or whomever else had it go wrong for 20 years. I think my father's mentality was like that as well. He was so convinced in the 1930s that capitalism was wrong because it was driving these people to the streets to ask for soup in New York City, and the Soviet answer was the right answer. It was just so deeply important to him that he didn't want to see evidence that contradicted it.
Because there were no bread lines in the Soviet Union, right?
Well, there were, but he couldn't see them. There was a terrible famine in Ukraine at the time he went there.
Right.
You know, as bad as the Mao Zedong famine almost, maybe not that bad, but he came back from the Soviet Union saying that's all capitalist propaganda. There's no famine in the Soviet Union. Everybody eats well, because he was led on a tour where everybody was seen to eat well.
That actually kind of reminds me of currently, because we are a show on YouTube, there are a lot of, travel vloggers on YouTube, travel YouTubers who are going to China. They don't speak Chinese.
Right.
And they're brought on these state-sponsored tours of, beautiful cities. They go to Chongqing, go to Shanghai, go to like beautiful Suzhou or whatever, and are kind of pumping up. Go to Xinjiang, there's no concentration camps here. There's the world's best cotton, and then that's what they kind of think and like they portray in their videos.
There's a spectacular example of that that's just come out in the last couple of weeks when the head of the Princeton University Press, named Henry, I can't remember her first name, but she went on one of these guided tours to Kashgar in Xinjiang, and she observed Tajiks and Kazakhs and Uzbeks, all these people dancing with their colorful native costumes on. It was crass colonialism if you compare it to tours of Africa and so on during the colonial era. Anyway, she said, and you can look it up on YouTube, she said that this was a dramatic example of how cultures could intermingle and understand each other and get along well. And her evidence was she saw people dressed up in colorful uniforms dancing at a prearranged site in Kashgar in Xinjiang. And that's her way of saying that all this stuff about the Uyghurs in concentration camps and their religion being decimated and their children being forced to go to school in Mandarin, that's not what's happening. Really, everybody's dancing together. Very embarrassing, especially for me, because I'm from Princeton and I've published with the Princeton University Press. And to see that it's amazing to me that someone could be that high in a position in Princeton and still be so naive, A, to believe that it's true, that cultural exchange is that easy, and B, to think that her audience, people like you and me and others, are stupid enough to buy it if she comes out and says it. It was really embarrassing.
Well, and there's one other thing is her failure to ask questions while she was there, or try, like, one of the things you can do if you are on a state-sponsored tour to, whether it's Xinjiang or any authoritarian place, is, say, oh, can I go see this, or can I go talk to people, or I'm in Kashgar, I'd love to see people praying at a mosque, and what would they have said? Oh, well, we can't show you that today.
Right.
The mosque is closed.
The mosque is closed, right? So those little things that just any intellectual you would think would know. Let me just ask a few questions at least and see what that response is. And if you don't even bother to ask questions, I mean that's the embarrassing part for an academic. Did you like what you just saw? Well, check out Perry Link's book, The Anaconda in the Chandelier. The link is below. And if you want to watch the entire hour-long interview with Perry Link with tons of cool stories, check it out on our website, ChinaUncensored.tv. The link for that is below.